Please. So good evening and welcome everybody to the City of Lake Forest Park City Council special meeting for Monday, June 9th, 2025. I'd like to call this meeting to order and I would entertain a motion for adoption of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, it's adopted by unanimous consent. Thank you, Council. We have 3 items tonight, and as is state statute, we cannot add or change the, well, we can move things around, but we can't add things to the agenda because it's a special meeting. First of all, we have item A, welcome and introduction of our new council member, Ashton McCartney, and Deputy Mayor Fertani is going to do the honors of introducing Ashton.
This is a great honor. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And I'd like to introduce to our community Ms. Ashton Alvarez McCartney. She's our newest council member. Welcome.
Yeah.
She's a longtime resident of the city. Her day job is working as an employee benefits consultant. And for our community, she's done so much. Not only is she involved with Lake Forest Park Elementary, as well as the Easter egg hunt, but she lives up in the Horizon View neighborhood where she uses all the parks. And most recently has been working with the working on the Planning Commission and has served both as the chair and the vice chair of the Planning Commission. So we thank you and we look forward to working with you and bringing your experience and expertise to the council.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome, Ashton.
Thank you.
And I just add to everybody, it is an honor to have Ashton serving on the council with all of you all. I know the selection process was difficult. And at the same time, it was wonderful that we had amazing candidates. Every one of them, all 8 were extraordinary. The 6 that were interviewed did a fantastic job, and we hope they will continue to stay engaged with civics and be willing to lend their expertise and their neighborly friendliness to our mission here at the city. So welcome, Ashton.
Thank you so much.
We are on item B now, Ordinance 25-1309, Unit Lot Subdivision Code Amendments. Director Hoffman, welcome. This is what we've been talking about for
Thank you, Mayor Council.
quite
a while. Mark Hoffman, Community Development Director for the record. I'll just start off with a little bit of framework, just to be brief, and then there's a formal presentation. The Planning Commission made a recommendation of amendments to the Lake Forest Park Municipal Code to address housing, unit lot subdivision, accessory dwelling units, and a little bit of cleanup. There are other bills out there, and the discussion is broad, but we'll frame it with it's taken a while to get here. Originally, we were locked into comprehensive plan before last December for meeting our Growth Management Act deadlines. Commerce, and I can't remind enough, provided grant assistance for development of new regulation amendments for middle housing. City received that in the amount of $50,000 from Commerce to do the work before you tonight. SCJ Alliance was contracted through this effort, and we have 2 representatives tonight to give a PowerPoint presentation and walk through the mission recommendation, answer any questions, and get started with discussion. We did an introduction at the 2nd regular meeting in May to give a bit of background, and tonight would be the first opportunity to dive into the specific amendments in preparation for a notice to public hearing Thursday night, the 12th. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Mark. Before we dive into our intros, will we be sharing the PowerPoint, or will you be doing that on your end? Can you clarify?
Sure.
If you would like control of your screen, you can, or the slides and progressing them, you could share your screen.
Okay, just want to make sure that was acceptable. But thank you for the intro. My name is Kirsten Peterson. I'm with SCJ Alliance, and I've been in this field for a couple decades, and working in middle housing was quite a fun process, learning with the community together as the state continually updated their guidance. I'm joined by Zoe, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zoe Taper. I'm a planner with SCJ Alliance. I've been involved in many different middle housing projects for this, even going back to when the first initial grants were done for missing middle housing reports. So I'm excited to be here and to help Lake Forest Park in this update. I draw on a background, excuse me, of over 5 years in legislative advocacy. So I tend to know how to navigate different legislative updates, and I'm happy to provide any guidance there as well. Thanks.
And we're both joining you tonight because we've both been working heavily on this project with a little bit of other assistance. But for tonight, I'm going to present. Zoe's going to be taking notes in the background. And then if we need to open up the ordinance itself or anything in the agenda report, we can do that. We've also been trying to address some of the questions that came to us in advance of the meeting. So we're ready for that. And so not to say we may not both be at the future meetings on this topic, but we wanted to both be here for this first introduction. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen with the PowerPoint. And before I turn on the slideshow, let me just make sure, are you seeing the middle housing update presentation? Okay, great. So get it going from the beginning. So yeah, as we said, we were happy to help Lake Forest Park with this project. I know that SDJ Alliance had done a lot of work with your comprehensive plan as well. So some of the conversations really went back before we dove into this specific work product. But what we're going to do today is just go through an overview of the middle housing state mandates, talk through the timeline and approach, and then related to middle housing are the subdivision requirements that go along with it. So we've got some information for that as well. And then, you know, to be quite frank, the slideshow, we will end it, but depending on the types of questions you have, we have several other slides. I believe that they were going to be made available to this group, perhaps via email or online, but it also answers a lot of the council questions. So just a quick overview. You do have an agenda report that was included with our technical report, but to just give you some of the background on this, in 2023 and 2024, the state legislature passed several House bills related to housing, and the three that are applicable to you tonight are House Bills 1110, 1337, and 2321. So they essentially required cities to update zoning to allow middle housing types and increase density in residential areas. There's a housing situation in the state where there's not necessarily enough housing, and there's not always housing that is deemed affordable. So they've been trying to come up with a lot of solutions here. Along with the increased density in middle housing, cities are also must allow at least 2 accessory dwelling units on all lots that are located in zoning districts that allow for single family homes. So regardless of whether a community used to have an ADU ordinance in effect already, the requirement is now that you have to have the 2 ADUs are allowed. And finally, all cities are also required to update their subdivision code to allow for unit lot subdivisions and 0 lot line subdivisions. That's just a real quick primer. We're going to have more slides that delve more into that on what a 0 lot line subdivision is or a unit lot subdivision, and some graphics to go along with that. So regarding the timing, as your director indicated, we held several months worth of meetings with your planning commission. And even before that, there was a lot of meetings with the comprehensive plan and talking about densities and what kind of uses you wanted allowed. But what we're doing now is working off the requirements for middle housing. So the planning commission, they reviewed the amendments. They sent a formal recommendation to city council. You can see we're here at the June 9th date. The requirement is that city council holds at least 1 public hearing before taking action. And that hearing is scheduled for the 12th. So tonight's just an opportunity to really dive in. We can present, you can ask questions, make sure there's a good understanding. And the goal is to adopt at the June 26th meeting in order to meet the deadline of June 30th. And we have this disclaimer on the bottom. If the city does not adopt an ordinance before June 30th, there is a model ordinance that the state developed that would take effect. It would essentially supersede your existing ordinance. It would take precedence if there's any differences in setbacks or height allowances or densities. So it would just take effect. So what we've tried to do here is have the conversations that get you at meeting the minimum requirements, but also where there's some local policy choice that the planning commission worked on with the director. So with middle housing, you have been deemed a tier 3 community. And in your packet, it gives a little bit more description about what a tier 3 community is, but it really comes down to your location, the size of the county you're in, and your population size. So you're actually in that class that's a little bit lower. You don't have as many requirements as some of the other communities. But for tier 3 cities, the following configurations must be allowed for. So we've highlighted the 4 with these pictures. There's 9 of them here. Some of the communities have to allow for all 9. That would be tier 1 communities. But for Lake Forest Park, you're going to need to allow the 2 ADUs, a duplex, stacked flats, cottage housing, and courtyard apartments. And the 2 ADUs was also a local policy decision to kind of keep in line with the requirement of allowing for the types of units that could be reasonably built with a 2 unit per lot configuration. There was some previous guidance that they were trying to indicate that you could potentially put 4plexes. And I can't even remember, Zoe, what else they were saying, but the state heard back from enough jurisdictions to say, we can't actually fit that many units. So they narrowed it down to the types that you could get 2 units per lot on. So our approach with the Planning Commission is that we met regularly to develop a compliant ordinance that aligned with the middle housing requirements. We didn't want to go too far overboard. And I will note that the Planning Commission still wants to study out potential future options for looking at additional densities, but they felt like more discussion was warranted. And for our purposes tonight, everyone really just wanted to make sure we met the guidelines and the guidance from the Department of Commerce so that the model ordinance wouldn't take precedence. So once again, it's intended to meet baseline state requirements. And then the focus area with the monthly sessions was to look at the middle housing provisions, the guidelines provided by the state, looking at the work that Leland Consulting had done to figure out, well, what kind of densities can you fit and where? And then really diving into the ADUs and what a unit lot subdivision means. The next steps for, the type of work the Planning Commission was considering was looking at affordability strategies, looking at unit density ADU considerations, and other potential updates to the development standards. Now, I mentioned before that we were going to dive a little bit more into the subdivision requirements. So as part of the middle housing bill, it included a provision that stated a city must also allow 0 lot line short subdivisions where the number of lots created is equal to the unit density required in this normal section. So a subdivision is just a division of land, and a short subdivision would be 4 lots or less. A long subdivision would be 5 lots or more. So what the state is saying that you have to allow a 0 lot line short subdivision if it's going to meet within your unit density requirements of 2 units per lot. So this means that Lake Forest Park must allow a 0 lot line subdivision to take a single residential lot that we've got depicted here in this parent lot and divide it into 2 lots. And here's 2 examples. Here's a standard subdivision of the lot, and here's one that's a 0 lot line subdivision, which in essence just means that the lot lines can touch. There doesn't need to be a setback between the 2 of them. It's really what it comes down to. And the only reason it's called a short subdivision, once again, is it's 4 lots or less. You could take a standard lot in your city, and depending on how large it was, it may be a short subdivision or maybe a long subdivision. So this is just differentiating with allowing for some smaller lot sizes. Now, a unit lot subdivision is a little bit different. It's a type of subdivision that allows a parent lot. So this is a graphic from the design guidelines or from the model housing ordinance guidelines. So it allows you to take a parent lot and divide it into 2 or more unit lots within a development. So it can be a short subdivision if it's 4 or less. It can be a long subdivision, but in your community, it's really only going to be the short subdivision for right now. And I'm going to go back to this slide here where it talks about taking the parent lot and making sure that your unit lots fit within there. So for instance, you had a house on this portion of the property and you were able to fit an ADU or cottage housing on there. The unit lot subdivision is actually the process to allow you to carve off the piece of land where that second unit is located. And then you could sell it for fee simple and allow some home ownership opportunities. And that's kind of what it's showing here. If you had a lot that allowed you to have 3 units, then you could subdivide and sell off the lot with unit A, lot B, and lot C. Now, there's some caveats to how that works. And we'll kind of dive into as we go forward with this information here. But essentially, some of the things that you have to be aware of, if you're gonna have a second lot per se, here, this is another example configuration with a long, a parent lot that has a long rear yard, and you had a principal unit up here already, and then you were able to fit a second unit on the rear of the property, but there wasn't parking in the front. One of the things it allows for is you to share the parking on one of the lots, but you have to have regulations in place to allow for parking. And then, as we've got depicted here, some access and utility easements to get to that second lot. So part of this comes down from the State Subdivision Act update that occurred in 2023. So all cities, towns, and counties must include in their short plat regulations procedures to allow for this unit lot subdivision to occur, where you take the one parent lot and divide it into those separately owned units. Portions of the parent lot not subdivided for these individual unit lots can be owned in common, and that's what we're talking about here with the areas highlighted for easements. Here are some other examples that are not necessarily applicable in Lake Forest Park at this point in time, but if you were to go to 4 or fewer lots, these are some examples of how you take a parent lot and you've got your street here, and you're gonna add 3 lots, and then you have the shared driveway come down here, and that's how you access this end lot. If you have 5 or more lots, which would not be a short subdivision, this would be your standard subdivision type, but still a unit lot. It's showing how you could potentially fit 5 or more. Now, the caveat is you still have to meet all of the setback and development code standards for the parent lot as a whole when you're determining whether you can fit additional unit lots on here. And this is an example of taking a parent lot and doing a lot split where this unit lot doesn't meet the minimum lot size, but the entire thing together, you could still meet setbacks and other requirements. So what types of middle housing can use the subdivision code? So you can have cottage housing, you can have detached accessory dwelling units that are separate from the main building, or they might be attached ones, perhaps, that might turn into like a 0 lot line subdivision case. Duplexes if they're side by side, and then courtyard apartments. Now, we previously mentioned that stacked flats are included in the middle housing types, but because they're a unit on top of another one, the only way to subdivide those, in essence, is actually to just do a condominium. You wouldn't actually be selling off separate property for those. So those are the ones that you can do that with. And then there's some limitations. I dove into this a little bit, but when you do the subdivision of the property, the zoning code still applies unless there are specific exceptions called out in your code. The total lot coverage for the parent lot is applied to all of the lots collectively. So if your original lot has a 25% lot coverage requirement, adding additional units, you still have to show that you can meet 25%. So when we present these requirements and saying that your code has to allow for this to happen, a developer, an applicant, a homeowner coming into the city will still need to visit with the city staff and determine whether or not, hey, is there room to fit another unit on here? And the answer may be no. And this is also not the city's going to be building any of these units. It's just saying you have to allow for it. And then all the standard provisions would still apply. Getting back to this PowerPoint, all unit lots would need to be outside of the critical areas or buffers. Talked about this already, but you got to meet the minimum lot areas, the minimum densities, dimensional requirements, etc. And then moving on to the next one, additional limitations. I showed you this with the graphics, but you can park for one unit on another unit or another lot as long as you have the right recorded easements. And you do have to have easements for ingress, egress, emergency vehicles, and utilities with a recorded easement. And just want to also point out that the individual unit lots are not separate buildable lots in the traditional sense. So it's going to be a matter of staff tracking, like, hey, you know what, you've done a unit lot subdivision, and that unit lot subdivision doesn't necessarily meet our minimum requirements for the lot size. But they were able to determine that you could fit another unit lot that met middle housing, and then it's kind of limited to that. You can't really exceed that. If one of the lots for a unit lot subdivision is for an accessory dwelling unit, you can't convert that ADU to a different type of dwelling unit later. And then we also need to start out with, staff would make sure that you're not going to be creating any nonconformities. Ideally, you'd be starting with a lot that's already conforming and then making sure you can fit another unit lot on there. But we're not, the staff is not going to allow for nonconformity. You still have to meet all those dimensional standards, et cetera. And then additional divisions of land, which create a new lot, would not be permitted in the unit lot subdivision itself. So there's a lot of caveats to it. It's not always going to apply on every lot in town, but it's where it works and where it makes sense. And then we wanted to dive a little bit into what we actually changed in the code. You've got a really long ordinance. I've got it pulled up here. I believe it's 75 pages long. And I'm not going to pull up the ordinance itself unless there's a question about a specific area. But I'll just point out that within the ordinance itself, it's not in track changes, but we highlighted everything in red text. That's something new that is being added. So you'll just be able to kind of go through it a little more quickly. But we're going to just kind of highlight what the edits were to it. And so we did update some definitions. And all this is just to comply with the minimum requirements of the middle housing mandates. But we're updating the definitions for subdivision and short subdivision. And then we're adding new definitions for parent lot, unit lot, lot split, unit lot subdivision, and zero lot line subdivision. And then chapter 17.12 also just has some updates in it, just to provide more clarity on these different sections regarding the application. What does this apply to? What are the exemptions? Some clarity on the design standards, the approval procedures, filing, recording, and addition of the unit lot subdivision standards themselves. Now, with the unit lot subdivision standards, we don't necessarily have it all spelled out in the PowerPoint, but on pages 4 and 5 of the agenda report, we provided a lot more explanation of what a unit lot subdivision is. And let me see, I just want to make sure. Was looking over the PowerPoint earlier, and I want to make sure that we did not, in fact, put the unit lot subdivision information in there, but it really provides a lot of information about the application requirements, the development standards that apply, how you do the management of the common area. And then there's even required plat notes that it says you have to put on the plat itself. This is a unit lot subdivision, or that's the title, unit lot subdivision. And that the development approval was based on the overall site plan for the parent lot. So there's going to be some reminders for staff in the future, making sure there's certain notes on these plats. And then there's some procedures regarding or approvals and expiration, and then also some addition about tree canopy requirements. So the planning commission definitely wanted to make sure that was included as well. Moving on to the next slide. Regarding middle housing, there's several new definitions added there as well. The ones in red on your screen are definitions that needed to be added exactly as required and laid out by the RCWs. And then, so it's administrative design review, which means that you have to allow for the review of middle housing units to be done administratively, and it cannot be any more onerous than what you're doing for single family residence. And then we're adding the definitions for cottage housing, courtyard apartments, development regulations, duplex, major transit stop, middle housing, single family zones, stacked flat, and townhouses. Now, townhouses are not required in your community, but it's still just a definition. The state says it has to be included in the code. So it's just included in there. Doesn't mean it's allowed. And then we also added definitions for tier 3 city. It's not required, but it just helps for clarity. It's a definition the state provided, but they're just saying you don't have to include it. And then we also added one for unit density. We also updated the definitions for attached ADU and detached ADU and multifamily dwelling. Oop, sorry. I was thinking as in a Word document, I was trying to scroll down my screen and I went to another slide. But we've also changed the use chart. So we've added uses to the chart for duplex, cottage housing, stack flats, courtyard apartments, and duplexes. So essentially adding those middle housing types and the zoning districts that they're allowed in. And they essentially just have to be allowed in all the districts that are designed primarily for single family housing. Okay, now moving on to the ADUs, just wanted to share a little bit more information about ADU regulations in order to comply with House Bill 1337 and the RCW. So amendments to the code include the fact that we talked about earlier, 2 ADUs must be allowed per single family home, but none are allowed on lots that have a duplex or other middle housing lot. Another development standard change is that they're only allowed on lots that meet the minimum size requirements and they have a sewer connection. There are parking exemptions near transit stops. That's required by state law. It also allows for you to convert a garage or an accessory building into an ADU, and with the caveat that if the garage is providing the required parking space for the principal structure, you have to provide the parking elsewhere on the property. It doesn't necessarily need to be in a garage, but you have to demonstrate that you can meet the parking requirements for the main home and the ADU. And when they talk about garages, a lot of times folks will build a unit above the garage. You'll see that a lot of times. Sometimes that's actually the only way to add another unit on a lot is to build above a garage. And then something that we added, so it says newly added, but essentially this is not for you guys. The Planning Commission, we went through a few revisions, but the Department of Commerce wanted us to add the condominium conversion of ADUs must be allowed through the unit lot subdivision process. So that was incorporated into the version you've seen. And they also required we add the provision that simply states this: the ADUs can be sited at the lot line if it's in abutting a public alley, if it is not routinely snowplowed. Unlikely to have snow there, but this is just a provision that they said you need to include in there. And so after they did their review, there's just a few comments, and those were a couple of them, so we added those in there, and that gets you into compliance. Another change is regarding the off-street parking requirements. So per the RCW, no off-street parking will be required within 1/2 mile walking distance of a major transit stop. And we haven't listed any in the code. It's just something you state in there. So over time, if you end up, having major transit stops in your community, you can look to those to, the staff would look at that to determine if parking is required. Now, the other thing that changes here is it's stating that for lots that are less than 6,000 square feet, your code cannot require more than 1 parking spot. If it's 6,000 square feet or larger, your code can only require 2 parking spots. Those are the allowances in the code. You can't require more. That doesn't mean somebody can come in and request more than that if they can fit it on their property. Say it's a homeowner, they're coming in to do this and they want 2 or 3 spots and they can fit it on their lot, then you can allow that. It's just kind of dictating where you draw the line with what you require. That has all of our presentation on that, but we have a lot of information that we gave you in the agenda report. There's some other materials, and then we also have other information available to share with you as you have questions. But at this point, I think what we wanted to do is just let you ask questions. We can pull up the ordinance if you want. We can go back to slides if you want to see graphics again, or how you'd like to approach this. But want to turn the time back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Peterson. Really appreciate your presentation. I apologize. My printed agenda is backwards from my digital agenda, so that's
Okay.
confusion arose with me. But I know our friends here on the dais have lots of questions for you. If you'd like to go around the horn, folks, who would like to take the turn first? Mr. Lebo.
Thank you for the presentation this evening, Ms. Peterson. So a couple questions. As I read through the ordinance, did I understand that frontage requirements go away? Frontage being to the primary street, such that when you showed the subdivision options, they're oftentimes referred to as flag lots, that you just have for other units a driveway, but they don't have actually any frontage on the primary street.
If you're going to do a unit lot subdivisions, we gave you some examples that were, like the really long lots with large backyards. every lot's gonna just be unique depending on where the principal structure is, or even if you're working with a vacant lot, what you can fit on there. So it's not gonna necessarily be a flag lot in the traditional sense. Unit lots are unique, and it looks like Mark might have something he wants to say. Is that correct?
I guess when I read the ordinance, the requirement for frontage went away. Is that correct?
It goes away for the unit lot, but not the parent lot. There is a parking lot item at Planning Commission to look at reducing or doing away with frontage minimums for a variety of residential zones. The question that we will look at that time is not whether a flag lot can come down, but an easement. That's not clarified at this point. Both are in our code. But what's clear is if a parent lot meets the frontage requirement, the unit lot does not need to.
Okay.
And I'll
to-
just share my screen again really quickly and take you to part of the ordinance, just an example one, like the R20 residential low district. The street frontage has stayed the same at 75 feet. And Mark is correct. There was discussions about changing that frontage. For a typical lot, it's going to stay in place, and that parent lot, as we discussed, will still have that same requirement. And unit lots are unique. They're brand new to this community and many others in the state.
Okay, so the parent lot maintains the frontage, but the unit lot does not.
Correct.
Okay. And then the other question I had was half mile from bus stops on a high capacity route. So what does that look like on the map of Lake Forest Park?
I do not have a map or an exhibit, and that is the next item at Planning Commission. There are at least two other bills dealing with parking. And so what we did here is meet the middle housing parking mandates in the Commerce Guidance, the accessory dwelling unit mandates in the guidance. But there are other legislative items dealing with parking, one from this session, transit-oriented development, that we have not analyzed yet. So as a group, parking requirements to take us into the future, that will be an effort of the Planning Commission. I'll also offer, this is a work in progress. In Olympia, we don't even know what's coming our way in the next session. So this will address where we were at last year. It will be compliant with middle housing. It will be compliant with ADUs, but it will not have caught up to the legislature.
So with that in mind, though, if you're a developer and we pass this ordinance at the end of June, how will they figure out what is within a half mile of a transit stop? Will there be an exhibit that outlines what that looks like?
There will be during implementation in accordance with the code in place at that time. There's a variety of definitions of what that applies to. Any BRT stop, a major transit station. And so we will be interpreting that, putting that in code, clarifying, and hopefully, to be honest, they stop tinkering with the parking so that we can catch up. But that is the major difference. This is not Sounder. This is not light rail. But as far as the BRT lanes that go down 522, it's been a moving target. If we were starting this effort today, we would have the opportunity to include those in there. In the interim, we will be consistent with this code for any applications that we get. The feedback we've gotten is that's not a problem for us developers because we're going to provide it anyway because we would like to sell our product.
Okay.
So we have that window, but we're not going to stop with just middle housing and ADU mandates.
Right, but when we adopt this ordinance, there won't be a map showing what a half mile is from a bus stop.
Well, we have the background exhibits in the comprehensive plan, but that's not at the development regulation level. Enough to determine. And then through parcel viewer or some sort of implementation verification, we would make sure that they're meeting the minimum. We think they will exceed the minimum.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Lebo. Colleagues, other questions? Councilmember Riddle.
This may be a bit detailed, but I'm trying to understand this new sort of unit lot subdivision piece of it. Especially if the parent lot or the original parcel could be divided, let's say, into two parent lots, and then we can divide those into unit lots. I think my question might be more for Mark. Can that be done at one subdivision process? Or would that be like two different processes that would be going in front of you? One for the original, like one to divide a parcel into two parcels and then one to divide the two parent lots into their unit lots. How would you handle
That
something
involves
complex like that?
a series of assumptions.
Yeah.
If this is passed and this is codified, were to approach staff and simply ask that question, I have this much area, what could I do with it? The clear way is you could lot split, subdivide, divide it any way you want, as long as you meet the minimum lot area and so forth, and that's available to you today administratively. What's not clear is I would like to do that and put 2 ADUs and a thing on this half and a duplex on this half, and here's my application.
Mhm.
There is no merged application process, nor has there been a case of that. So the clearest way for staff to answer is do your subdivision, make those two parent lots exist, right? And then there's no ambiguity. And it's not likely to be appealed. It's pretty basic. Then within that, do your unit lot subdivision before you construct or after you construct, or use condominium for those individual unit lot structures. That's the cleanest way that I see it.
Proceeding at
If
this time.
July 5th, I'm asked that question. That's likely how I would proceed.
Thinking for the community to kind of keep track, because I know they'd want to monitor these things as they come up. So kind of understanding that process would be helpful for.
And
folks that are paying attention.
and it comes down to definitions, and that's why clarity is important. If you come in and you say, I have 3 acres and I would like to do all this unit lot, in total, there's 24 unit lots here. I would say that's a subdivision. But the clear way is to follow the code. It gives you 2 options, subdivision or short subdivision. And in short subdivision, you could do unit lot. Once you do unit lot, it's on the front page. That's it. That's the end of the road for that parent lot.
Colleagues, other questions? Councilmember Goldman.
Yes, thank you. You actually answered most of my questions already. I had submitted those in advance. And so between your presentation plus the appendix slides, a lot of my questions are answered. This one's a little bit in the weeds. If you were to go to section 18.24.020B, there's a sentence that's, or do you want me to give you a moment to pull that up?
Yeah, let me get to 1824. Hold on a sec.
.020B.
Okay.
The second sentence says, no such dwelling unit shall be occupied by more than one family. A few years ago, we amended the definition of family, that basically we're not in the business of policing who counts as a family, whether it's related by marriage, by blood, by friendship, or other means. And so I'm just wondering, does that sentence have any bite to it? Because it seems like if we're not going to really be asking you to prove that you're a family, we can't really prove that you're 2 families.
Well, honestly, we weren't looking at that when we were looking at the middle housing compliance, but if that's something that you want struck, we could easily do that. We've seen that elsewhere and realized that as you're saying this is a perfectly acceptable sentence to remove.
Yeah, I'd be supportive of striking that sentence. Just since
That'd be consistent with all the other amendments in code. We're going away from defining single family. We're going away from defining family and going towards the type of structure. So it wasn't an intended amendment, but it's good to catch any possible amendments.
Well, it just made me wonder if there are other sections like that, but that may have been the only one, and thank you for pointing that out. We can make that. So Zoe's gonna make the edits on her end. Taking track or keeping
But I
track.
think that's an excellent point. It's really, we've had a very robust discussion about family, and we want to make sure that we're not constraining the definition by any stretch of the imagination. So, Councilmember Good. I'm sorry, Councilmember Riddle was first.
If I could
apologize. And then-
If I
okay.
could have one more note before we possibly
Please.
change subjects, real brief. As we achieve or desire amendments or changes for Zoe to track between here now and action, if there's some consensus or some way of noting so that we don't have to revisit them.
Should we do a head nod? Everybody comfortable with Councilmember Goldman's proposal? Looking around the dais. There you go. Think that work for you, Mark? Okay. Yes, please, because we're good.
I just want to clarify, that means that this whole document will be, or the whole code will be reviewed for the family statement. Okay, thank you.
Let's do that.
Okay, great. Colleagues, other questions continuing on here? Deputy Mayor Fortuny.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. And I really do appreciate basically the care with which the tree canopy coverage was protected. The fact that we have days like today makes that all the more clear it's necessary. My question was, and this is just basically me probably being looking at the wrong version, but what was the thinking behind removing the language on short-term rentals?
Let me think through that. I believe that that was a state requirement, but that was one that could be determined at the local level. But let me ask Zoe, can you point me to the section of code? I need to.
Yeah, well, in the version I was looking at, unfortunately, it was very vague. It was 18.08.0XX.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's an older version for certain.
That was an older version to where I believe our team had added in the possibility to feel out how Planning Commission felt about that sort of language. But then in hearing that council hadn't taken a stance on restricting the short-term rental situation, we struck it out. So it was an edit that had been added and then removed later.
Thank you, Zoe.
Yeah, thank you.
Deputy Mayor, on point, I just wanted to talk about, mention something about tree canopy coverage.
Mm-hmm.
In the Seattle Times a couple of days ago, our friend Jerry Paulette, Representative Paulette, sent a memo to city council members on Monday stressing that Seattle is in fact mandated by middle housing legislation and the Growth Management Act to protect trees. Quote, Seattle may and should meet its climate and related mature tree canopy and runoff prevention policies for adoption of tree preservation ordinances that preserve from development the best remaining mature tree canopy coverage in the face of dramatic loss of trees in recent years, he wrote. Lot coverage regulations may simultaneously allow for preserving tree canopy and reducing harmful runoff. I thought that was an important context to share from our friend Jerry, who we're no longer in his district, sadly, but I think it is really important because there is that balance, and we have always put a stake in the ground for the environment here in this community, as well as promoting diversity of housing. Yes, please continue.
Okay, so and then the last one was I thought I knew how to basically do calculations, but apparently I don't. So can you go through on 18.45.030 lot area and maximum density? I thought I understood that calculation, and then the answer turns out to be something I wasn't expecting at all. So there's a calculation that it does at the very last sentence, which ends up with basically 2 units. And for the life of me, I can't understand that sentence.
All right, let me pull it up.
Clarity, we're at 1845.030.
030.
No. And then let me look at which zoning district we were looking at. The Southern Gateway, low density residential. And since we're looking at this, you may have caught on, but we basically had to remove the term single family from the zoning district names and just use different terminology for the state requirements. But okay, getting to this lot area and maximum density. Zoe, are you able to speak to that one a little bit?
Yeah, that was an existing calculation for that area for determining the maximum density within that zone. However, since it is a residential zone, it, I believe, wouldn't be able to pencil to be lower than 2 units to be allowed for on that lot. So that edit was made to try to essentially create a range with the existing calculation without changing too much, if that makes sense to this group here. Open for conversation if it does not make sense.
And we'd love to hear from Mark too, if
Yes.
the staff would be the ones administering this.
Dropping, you would jump in first, and then Councilmember Vice Chair Goldman after.
Thank you. I know how I read it. Larger lot exists. This is the density for that zone, multifamily, et cetera. Rather large number, and this is how you calculate it. If you have a lot that happens to be very small in that zone, middle housing allows you to do a duplex. hence the minimum of 2. If you have an existing lot and you do the calculation and it comes out to 1.56, you are not precluded from doing middle housing duplex, similar to the other low-density residential, where it's allowed on existing lots that are substandard in lot area. That's how I
Director
read it.
Goldman.
So a bit of clarification, this section 1845 is for basically 12 degrees north.
Mhm.
And so this is strictly for the 12 degrees north, which is mostly townhomes anyway. So in some sense, it's a bit of a moot point because that neighborhood has already been fully developed. And some of the language, I guess it's a little bit awkward, but that was how the previous council defined this when they were creating the Southern Gateway area. So I suppose we have to change the language to be consistent with 1110, but it's also a bit of a moot point because there's already more houses there than is required by 1110.
So yeah, I appreciate the explanation, all of you. And I think the word that threw me was the word maximum density. I think it just meant maximum number of units or, dwellings or whatever the right word is there. The word density just threw me.
Did you have other comments? Okay. Let's make sure we've covered everybody. Councilmember McLean, any questions or comments? Okay. We've gone around the horn, I think, back to Councilmember Brittle then.
Thank you. So I'm still trying to mesh accessory dwelling units into this thing. It'd be so much easier if we just had one or the other. The one thing that I've noticed is in the accessory dwelling units, sort of section 1850. It does say that you can't have an accessory dwelling unit if you have middle housing already. Is that the simplest way of putting it? So if we were to have townhomes, two units, let's say 0 lot line, there they are. They couldn't do like a mother-in-law on their lower level. Is that correct?
Well, on a lower level, that throws in a different thing there, but basically, yes, if you have middle housing on the lot, you're not allowed to have an ADU on it as well. It's supposed to go along with the principal structure, but what you just said could be a possibility if it's an
They're
ADU.
both principal structures, right? Each
I
townhome
apologize.
is a principal structure on there. It's a single family. They just touch. So I guess what I'm saying is one of the reasons we're going through all of this is to allow that higher variety of housing types. And it feels like this is one area where, if you want to have an elderly family member stay with you, being on the lower level makes the most sense. And usually there's, it gives a good division between the families. So I've seen that quite a bit, just in general. You've got a mother-in-law or some sort of ADU on the lower level behind the garage or whatnot type of situation. So I just wanted to know if we think that that's allowed.
No, townhomes are not a housing type that we're proposing to adopt. Are there?
And that was just your example of townhomes, but yeah, we're not proposing to adopt that, but you just kind of were asking in general. And
Yeah.
I'm just going to share one of our other example graphics where it looks like you're talking about this type of ADU where you might have top level or lower level.
You are not sharing at the moment.
Okay. So can you state your question in another way? Just make sure that we respond correctly.
There we go.
So
Graphics.
if a lot is developed with 2 principal residential units meeting the definition of middle housing, such as a duplex, then no accessory dwelling unit is permitted on that lot, on the parent lot, in either unit lot. And I'm wondering if that makes sense from a variety of housing standpoint.
I mean, that's just simply accurate. When you just read it, it wouldn't be allowed. I guess the only scenario that I could envision is where maybe the duplex was on a very large lot and you're able to do like a 0 lot line subdivision that actually allowed each of those lots that met your minimum lot sizes to then have an ADU added as well. But it's all going to come down to each individual lot and, figuring out what you can fit on there and whether it does or doesn't comply with these requirements. And I see Zoe's wheels spinning there too. It's hard to anticipate every possible development scenario.
If,
Yeah.
and here's a hypothetical, if somebody approached me a month ago and said, I have a duplex, or I'd like to build a duplex, end of story. Single family zoning, single family detached. Now these rules come into play. It's clear duplex or unit lot subdivision alternatives, ADUs. What we can account for is a duplex was built in 1972, exists in the city now, annexed in for whatever reason. That's a nonconformity. What would happen to that nonconformity now that we're changing the rules that we haven't dealt with?
Yeah, I just keep going back to, when we revise the ADU code, try to make it more accessible to our community to be able to build these smaller living spaces, whether it be an ADU or a DADU. I want to make sure that we're continuing to honor that size and type of housing unit that we want to see as a part of our variety of housing in this community.
Councilmember Lebo.
Just to follow up on that, so is this a policy question for the council, or is this?
It is halfway through planning commission, mostly because of the model ordinance and the deadline of June 30th. It was a consensus, it was a decision to focus on minimum mandates and that other options were available. But the beauty in that is anything that exceeds the minimum mandates could be an affordable housing option, and some of that benefit could be analyzed to be clawed back in deed restrictions or some other tool. So that category was not explored as yet. These reflect the minimum mandates that meet the legislation.
But with that in mind, though, if the council wanted to, it could allow ADUs or DADUs on a unit lot if it met all the other requirements.
Correct.
But it was a recommendation from the planning commission not to do that as part of this recommendation.
As part of this, correct. Yeah.
Councilmember McLean.
Yeah, I would just add a little bit of volume. This was something that the group had spent a lot of time on. And I think in light of not having this deadline staring right at in the face, there were a lot of folks that wanted to explore that more. The concern around not adding additional capacity was from a unintended consequences perspective. And with the parking, as you'd shared that they hadn't had time to dive into the parking and utilities and all those different elements. So there's certainly a desire to do that, but the timeline was such a hurdle.
Yeah, I think the clarification, it's technically allowed, but we aren't going there yet is an appropriate way of approaching it at this point. We'll see where we end up as council later.
By way of example, you could adopt all 9 housing types here.
Ms. McCartney, I owe you an apology for calling you McLean. I call him Bob every once in a while, so I apologize. Yeah, Councilmember Goldman.
I have a sort of another example, kind of jumping off of ADUs versus duplexes. So hypothetically, if there's a lot that through annexation, they're in the 20,000 square foot zone, but they're only 19,000 square feet, would someone on that parcel be able to build a duplex?
That is the choice of the city, and as drafted right now, the answer is yes.
Okay, then if we go to 18.50.50D, we talk and I think this is something the planning commission was grappling with, that for ADUs, the answer would be no. That if the lot is not large enough, then an ADU is not allowed at all. Is that correct?
That's not correct. Those are the 2 corrections that we did at the public hearing. They made clear if you are substandard in lot area right now as a parent lot, you could still do an ADU. This language was revised. It may not have hit the mark. It could be further revised to clarify that. But the intent is you can't do that after.
Okay, I guess
Can't intensify nonconformity, but the planning commission recommendation is if you have a parent lot that's substandard in lot area, take away critical areas and trees, you can do middle housing and ADUs.
okay, and that I think addresses my concern. I think as a policy matter, I would like to see ADUs and duplexes treated as similar as possible. So like if the answer would be yes for a duplex, I'd like it to be yes for an ADU, and it sounds like that is the case.
That is the case. That's what staff believes that the intent of this language is. But if there is another layperson's way of reading that implies that it's not, then we should further clarify it.
Okay, thank you.
Colleagues, any other questions? Ms. McCartney, you're looking thoughtful.
No, that was good, good clarification.
Mr. Lebo.
But just to follow up though, your options under this current proposal is that you could have a duplex for a non-conforming, or you could have the ADUs, but not a duplex.
For parent lot, if you have an existing lot area nonconformity, you can do ADUs in middle housing. Prime example, you have a 20,000 square foot minimum lot area requirement. You have an existing parent lot at 19,500. Can you do a duplex? Yes. Can you do an accessory dwelling in or two? Yes.
So it is possible to have 3 units. You could have a primary and then an ADU and a DADU.
Correct. Yeah.
Or,
Unit lots.
yeah,
Yeah.
or it would just be a duplex.
And by way of example, if you propose 2 detached ADUs and one of those ADU structures exceeded the minimum, it could be argued that's a detached duplex. Our code is drafted right now that would be a cottage. That would be that cottage housing category because it exceeds the ADU maximum square footage. Everything else applies duplex attached, not stacked.
I'm sorry. Let's start with Deputy Mayor Johnny first and then Councilmember Riddle.
So my last 2 comments are basically to make sure that we honor the work of the really hard work of the Planning Commission in getting to this point. In 17.12.090, and I think there's a 0 missing on that one, unit lot subdivision, Commission Chair Castic mentioned that there should be some change in the words so that it's more clear about density and design starting. And this comment that's not on the clean version, but is on the other version is applicable unit density and designs and so forth. I'm wondering if that was addressed.
And Zoe may have it. That's also the reason we included that second version of the track changes with all the comments. To give some insight as to where their focus was, what their issue was, and how it was addressed. I don't have that version.
Right.
So
yeah, it was
Right now.
And I think you said 171290.
Yeah.
Subsection.
And he is correct. It should have been 090.
Yeah. I think it's subsection
Zero.
C. It was kind of hard to track all the lines.
On page 25 of your packet,
Yeah.
Council.
I believe you're talking about this, right?
Yes. And I think it was pointed at C, but it was sort of hard to tell.
Okay. Zoe, if you are able to find the other track change version, she's digging. There's just so many comments. That's why we gave 2 versions out there to demonstrate where we changed things.
We ran out of highlighter colors.
I saw that.
And so we went to the transition
Right.
from planning commission, give you a snapshot at still.
Right. And as I said, I didn't want anything to fall through the cracks. The other one was Commissioner Larson's comment in 18.16.060 and also in 0.070, so yards and buildings. Regarding on yards, the stepping back of the second floor another 5 feet to basically avoid shadows and other view restrictions. And then in 070, the height limit of 30 feet and how it's calculated, from what point, I guess it's calculated, and whether it's an average.
It is an average and it's in the definition.
It is, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. And then Councilmember Riddle.
I was questioning the same area, so 18, 16, 60, and 70, same place as mine. One was, help me remember, measured from the property line to the nearest point of the building. Is that like the roof eave, like in a floor plan, the nearest point, or is that like the wall?
It's
Do
the
you remember?
exterior wall.
Exterior wall.
I
Okay.
believe there are 4 things that can extend in. 18 inches of eave is the first one.
Okay. So just kind of trying to get that in my head where that would be. And then the other thought was, this is kind of the highest potential, like, I don't know, density type, middle housing, residential housing zoning. And one of the things I noticed, I think, and it was in the Southern Gateway Zone, was they increased it the height to 35 for where they were allowing sort of these slightly denser uses. Do you remember if the Planning Commission had any discussions around adjusting the heights for any of these?
They did not,
Vehicles.
but they had lots of discussion about consolidating similar zoning districts.
Okay.
Colleagues, other questions for friends online or for?
Lastly, I think we clarified, if you don't mind, we clarified tree canopy and how it has to be applied to each unit lot in middle housing. But when it comes to like, I guess the configuration of the two units can be however you need it to be in order to make the property work. So it works around the buffers and critical areas, steep slopes and all that stuff.
Correct.
But in those areas, do those apply as open space if they're buffers and critical areas?
That's
or-
another hypothetical. As we get into unit lot subdivision, you can have tracks, you can have common areas.
Yeah,
It's highly likely that well, I shouldn't say highly likely. It may be an advantage to have that in a separate track because of the common ownership.
yeah.
And so we'll explore that as we get in there. There's nothing that prevents it from being part of the unit lot. It doesn't have to be entirely zero lot line.
Okay.
But it may, if you're going to do development, normally we hear it doesn't pencil out. So almost always we see the maximum. What is the maximum I can do here so that I can get a loan and get this financed and build this thing? So we don't often have that kind of flexibility of where do you want to put it? So it's likely it'll be in an open space tract.
Okay. And the other piece is I think I saw somewhere that a yard was considered an open space, but the definition of open space was not considered a yard. So if we could just kind of look through and do some keyword searches and see if that was just my interpretation or if there is some sort of disconnect there.
Yeah, no open space should be associated with a required yard.
Yeah.
They're two complete different things.
And was that just a question that came up, or Zoe, do you remember? Was a question that arose, or was that actually in the code that it stated?
The
yard?
definition piece.
About a yard, the open space including the yard. I remember that came up as a question. So I was just trying to remember if it's in the code and we need to fix it, or if there's just questions about it.
I feel like the definition of yard said it's an open space that blah, 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 blah. But then the definition of open space
It's completely,
says it's not supposed to
Yeah.
be, it doesn't include yards. So I think that's where my brain just went like, okay, am I just misreading this or is
that's
this?
where
Councilmember
ish?
Good.
So,
I have a different question. So Southern Gateway residential, Southern Gateway commercial. Are there definitions for each? And do any of these changes change anything that's existing?
not for commercial in any way. For Southern Gateway, any amendments would be in that section for the residential.
I.e., I'm thinking of Lakeview, since that's the only property that's considered commercial that is not facing Bothell Way.
1845 is Southern Gateway, low density residential. The answer is yes, plenty of amendments for middle housing. Southern Gateway corridor, Southern Gateway transition, complete opposite. One change, two change for types, single family. This is the primary difference. And we haven't analyzed it for lot by lot.
Good question. Vice Chair Goldman.
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions about parking, and I recognize, I think this is also something that is, I guess, figuratively and literally in the Planning Commission's parking lot now. Here's just a couple, this is 1858.030. There's a table of all the parking rules around the city. And I think because of some of the requirements of 1110, there's a couple that seem a little counterintuitive. So within that table, I'm looking at rows 4 and 5 on single family, multifamily, and middle housing. So one of them is that if you're looking at transit, middle housing that is near transit does not require off-street parking. Apartment buildings near transit do require off-street parking. And it just seemed a little strange that apartments would require more parking than middle housing. And then kind of related to that, that if you have a 5,900 square foot duplex, that requires 1 lot. If you have a 1,000 foot studio apartment, you need 1.5 parking spots. And again, that seemed a little strange that you need more parking for a studio apartment than for a small, like a medium-sized duplex. And again, I think this is partly because of the language of 1110. And so I look forward to the planning commission trying to square that circle to make it so that we don't have any of those weird counterintuitive, the smaller the unit, the more parking you need, because that's a strange place to be.
And I'll just add, these are specific to 1110, 1337. We will be addressing Senate Bill 6015. And then I don't have the number for this session's transit-oriented development. Those amendments will be specific to those bits of legislation. Some guidance or capturing what else you would like us to look at, as opposed to a broad look at parking, including the option of having no parking requirements. So when we get into the effort of Planning Commission, we know the spectrum that we're charged with looking at. Out of the gate, we will be addressing the legislation before us of those types. We're always open to other things that pop up, other things they would like to look, but if there's some feedback from council that's specific to other things they should consider, that'd be useful.
I'm personally in favor of a broad look at what appropriate parking levels should be in our code. So I'd very much like to see the planning commission take that on.
Thank you.
Colleagues, if I may, as Director Hoffman indicated earlier, this is a bit of a moving target. We're trying to reconcile multiple bills that have been bearing down on us here with this middle housing and ADU deadline that's coming up at the end of this month. So what I would offer 2 things. One, let's not, again, as we've talked about before, the perfect be the enemy of the very good. But at the same time, I think to Councilmember Goldman's point, trying to be a little bit more forward thinking on some of these things, if you can anticipate what the needs are going to be, rather than having to come back and make these amendments on the fly. I don't mean with that with any disrespect, because it's a very serious process. If there are things that you can anticipate without trying to fit everything in, including the kitchen sink, let's try to make sure that we do that. Keeping that in mind, it's a good place for us to talk about. We have 3 meetings between now and the end of the month. Potentially, you may have to have an additional meeting depending on how your discussions go. So there is a sense of urgency that Director Hoffman feels, and I know everyone does. So I will make sure I keep reminding all of us, including the community, that this work has to be moving forward. And so we can't make it perfect. That's just the way it is.
And
Other questions?
there's also
Please.
guardrails with the Commerce Grant from last year, the scope of work in the SCJ contract, and what was tasked at the Planning Commission. We always go a little bit broader, but those are the parameters. So as we go into new efforts, setting those parameters from the outset is very important. And we do not have one staff member full-time dedicated to advanced planning. I would love to be that person. I don't have that advantage.
The other thing too, Director Hoffman told us the other day that any substantive changes would require another public hearing. So we have to be very mindful of staying within the broad strokes of what the Planning Commission has already prescribed for us. So there you go. Councilmember Riddle.
2 things. One, I think we're throwing a lot of things on a parking lot. I think maybe if we could have sort of a list that maybe you could share out, or someone can share out after the meetings, to make sure that we all got our parking lot items on there and know that, like, okay, I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's on the physical parking lot. That would be really helpful. And then the other place where would like to see if we need more information is in the definitions of cottage housing. and maybe even courtyard apartments, like, I'm still trying to figure out how those are different from some of the, you know, I don't know, different than the other ones. I mean, you can have two primary units or, primary houses on each one, each unit lot. But is cottage housing multiple units on one lot, or is that just two smaller things on the same space? And why would anyone do that? Because you don't get a benefit. Anyways, I'm just trying to understand what it is, so that I can speak to it more eloquently. And the last piece is if there's a way for us to define a little better as whether we're referring to a lot being a parcel, being a parent lot, or being a unit lot. 'Cause now these three things are actually like different sizes and have different rules governing them. And so when it says a lot, I don't know if they're talking about that on a parent lot or on a unit lot. So it'd be really helpful.
Staff is confident in implementation. We will know. We can implement these the first week of July. We do know what a subdivision is. We do know what a short subdivision is. We now know what a unit lot subdivision. So, but the danger of adding more descriptors is missing the point. There are types of subdivision. How it's talked about in each chapter is different, but
Mhm.
it's also very clear when each one is used.
So when we look at cottage housing being defined as cottage housing means residential units, plural, on a lot, singular, what does that mean?
In the sense of middle housing and how they use it in tier 1, tier 2, it's the traditional common shared courtyard, parking alley, and then 6, 7, 8 units for a tier 3 city. And this proposal, that's not a permitted use. So for us, it's two small structures that exceed the maximum square footage allowed for ADUs. It's a mandated housing type. That's why it's in there. It won't be common. I've never seen a 2 cottage development. So I've seen a small single family development with an ADU. They'll have to decide if that's really what they're aiming for.
Yeah.
But
So I pulled up those definitions from the current version with cottage housing. And as Mark said, cottage housing is unlikely gonna be the selection for a 2 units per lot, but it could be. And typically it's just they have a shared common space. And there's a difference where they, per state law, they only have to have a minimum of 20% of the lot size as open space. So this is where it differentiates between the two. And the courtyard apartment means an attached dwelling unit arranged on 2 or 3 sides of a yard or court. So those 2 units are attached. It's weird. And then you could potentially have them wrap around and have a courtyard in between, but the 2 units are attached. And the cottage housing, they are not attached. And so the definitions on your screen on page 19 of the ordinance kind of provide some differentiation. We've developed some graphics we could potentially pull up to show like what it could look like in the 2 unit configuration, but it's really quite strange.
It's essentially just two residential unit. It's like 2 houses. There's nothing really different than just putting one primary unit on each unit lot when it comes to these. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Where we're at right now.
kind of likely comes down to size. So for instance, the ADUs, if somebody were to do that, it's typically 1,000 square feet or less. If it's larger than 1,000, you're gonna, by definition, call it cottage housing. If there's a separation and there's a common open space. Courtyard apartment, they would be attached. And what that truly looked like, I don't know if anyone's really gonna call it a courtyard apartment. It might just be a duplex.
Yeah.
small.
I think we're getting.
No, I just,
hypotheticals that we
these are
might not
required to be
see.
there because we've picked it, but it's really doesn't change what people can do right now under this code. I guess that's what I'm hearing.
Not likely, but they're required to be in there. We're required to adopt certain types and it gets us there. In the future, triplex, et cetera, it makes more sense as a type. Possibly in the future, possibly for another city, but not for the scenario that we're going with a minimum mandate.
Okay, no, I just wanted to make sure that I knew what it was and what our minimum is now, and I'm happy with what it is right now.
No, that's a great question, because it gets a little bit strange. And I'm gonna share real quickly again, just the PowerPoint slide. These are not necessarily the greatest, in my opinion, pictures. But typically a courtyard apartment is where it's a wraparound structure and you have a courtyard in between, but they're all attached. And then the cottage housing, these are pictures provided by Commerce. We've developed some other ones that I think are better, but typically cottage housing, you're gonna have more than 2 units. You know, there's like a middle yard that everyone shares and you got some units wrapping around it, but they're not attached. But in the 2-unit configuration, it's just strange. I'll just say that.
Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, other questions? Councilmember Lebo.
I would just like to offer that as the liaison to the planning commission, that from the consultant presentations and the discussion with the planning commission, they've given this a great deal of thought. And we've talked about parking and ADUs, and those are clearly things that are of interest of the planning commission. And I think they came down on an approach that addresses the baseline state guideline requirements. And I think that's really appropriate for where we are today. So while we've talked about hypotheticals and other alternatives, I'm quite comfortable with what has been presented to us. I'll be interested to hear what the public has to say. Absent any significant changes, I think we are in a very good place right now.
Thank you, Councilmember. That's well put. Appreciate that, John. I agree completely. Colleagues, other questions? I think, again, we're coming up on public hearing on this Thursday. The pace is going to continue to accelerate here towards the end of the perilous end of the month, Mr. Hoffman, as I know then you'll be taking a much needed rest from all this work. But before we'll let you go, just want to make sure that we're not missing anything else. We'll have additional time to assess. Deputy Mayor Furtoni.
I just have a procedural question for Director Hoffman, which is, we have a special meeting scheduled on June 16th. So that's after the public hearing, of course. What do you see as kind of the goal of that particular meeting? Where would you like council to be at that point?
Given the deadline at the end of the month, it's hard to pass up any opportunity for additional comments, amendments, non-substantive amendments, clarity, opportunities. And so compare tonight to Thursday. Thursday is the public hearing, a little bit more formal. Next Monday being anything that is not clear or that bothers you or needs clarity on the record. Because on the 26th, we will be asking for action. And I believe the city attorney is patched in watching tonight. One additional item, it's not one ordinance anymore. It's now 2 to be considered in June. Separate out, there's Kim, separate out unit lot subdivision, Title 17 from middle housing and ADU to not violate the one subject rule.
That makes sense. Colleagues too, I would like to suggest as several of you, Councilmember Lebo, I think Councilmember Goldman sent in written questions and comments, thoughtful, as always, colleagues. That's a great way to go too, because of the truncated timeframe. So I know the staff really appreciates that too, because it gives them time to research it and get back to you and share it for the entire group. So thank you, John and Larry and whoever else. If I missed you, I apologize. The written comments are written questions are really helpful. Okay, anything else on topic here? And then we can let our friends, Ms. Peterson and Ms. Taper, go for the evening. Okay, going once. Appreciate it, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you both
Thank you.
very much online. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Excellent work as always.
Thank you for your time. We appreciated the opportunity to be here tonight.
Thank you.
Enjoy the weather.
Take
Thank
care.
you, Director Hoffman, as well. It's really appreciated. And with that, we're moving on to item C, continuing discussion regarding budget challenges. And I'm going to, for facilitation, hand this over to Deputy Mayor Furtoni.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And so everyone, I think you have distributed before you the revised version of the initial proposal that I handed out some time ago. And speaking of single subject violations of ballot provisions, one of the things that was pointed out, I believe, by a couple of you was that we were asking for both public works as well as public safety. So to try to narrow the focus to just public safety, I replaced the public works part with the mental health mobile crisis response, the RACER fee that we pay annually, roughly to the tune of $122,269. So that's what we approved in our budget, the 2025-26 budget that we adopted back in April. So the total turns out to be just about the same. And so the levy rate has not changed. So that's the only difference between that document and this one. All right, so Clerk McClellan, can you bring up the slide? Great. So this is what I don't need the decision today, but I need basically to kind of focus us on, we need to start working on these questions. So the first question is, are we actually going to go through with this? And if we do, then those three subsequent points become important. How much is the levy going to be for? How long is it going to be for? And for what purpose? I believe my proposal addresses all those points. But of course, it is up to us to decide whether or not we're going to go through with this or some variant of this. So are there any questions on my particular proposal here? Go ahead.
So I really appreciate the thought that went into this. And one of the places my mind is coming from is the areas that we've seen the biggest hit are those that we don't have control over. It's those contract services that just do what they need to, and then they give us the bill. And then we have to decide, do we want to stick with them or not? But for the moment, I'm wondering what you would think about as restructuring this slightly to cover, let's say, all the cost in 911 dispatch, all the cost in jail cost, all the cost in insurance. Basically saying what we want to do is we want to create a buffer for what we don't have control over, but those that we have control over may be able to drop off the list, because then we can predict those just a wee bit better if it's something that we control in-house. To get us to basically the same coverage of cost, but to be clear that we're buffering ourselves from outside impacts that we can't control as readily. And I think that might resonate better with folks, the public defender, prosecutor costs, things of that nature, the mobile crisis unit. So just as a thought, if you had thought of structuring it that way.
Yeah, that's a great thought. I appreciate the thoughtfulness, Councilmember Riddle. And of course, City Administrator Hill may contradict me when I say this stuff, but I will point out that one of the things that I'm really trying to show is that we're being responsible right now with covering these costs. And these, as you pointed out, were sort of some of them were unexpected hits. I've built the index to inflation CPI into this just so that we can those are the predictable sort of ones. All right. You're right. In the future, we may be hit with an insurance cost increase that's tremendous. And the hope here is that this will at least cover some baseline amount, that the rest would have to come from the general fund, because as you point out, this is, this is essentially unallocated money. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but basically the point being that I don't know that by covering the entire cost, we could keep the levy rate to what it is here, which to me is basically a minimal level.
Yeah. Mr. Deputy Mayor, if I might provide some historical and institutional context. One of the things that's come up in discussions, as well as with the interviews with our candidates for council, was the question of renegotiating contracts. I think it's important to recognize that there is a historical context here. One, 911 dispatch was previously something that was done by Bothell. We had a very, very, very good deal. They were undercharging us ostensibly. There really is only one other player in this game, and that's who we're working with. It would be incredibly difficult to renegotiate that kind of contract in any substantive way. The second thing, jail costs. Everyone is experiencing these jail cost increases. And additionally, insurance, the same kind of thing. Those are not things that we can negotiate in a new contract or anything else. We can certainly continue to try to sort out what we need to do, but we are part of an insurance pool, and the rates are set by the you know, the whole system effectively. And I'm not an underwriter and I'm not an insurance expert, but my understanding is what you see is what you get when it comes to these costs. So the reason why I wanted to mention that was I think it's important to understand that these costs are foundational. This is the new place where we have to start from. If we're looking for places for additional efficiencies or cuts, or that's different, that's a different place. You'd have to go to a different place than those, you know, whether it comes to jail, even public defenders. We're going to be looking at a situation potentially here down the line. We're going to have radical increase in expense for public defenders because of the legislature has been considering these mandates, and we'll see what happens. Costs continue to escalate on that. Insurance, public defender, and prosecutor costs as well, the same thing. We have to provide those services, and we have a very limited field of opportunities for efficiencies or cost cutting or renegotiation when it comes to those contracts. Just wanted to get that little piece in there.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that. Are there any other comments? Oh, Councilmember Good.
And I wanted to add that this doesn't mean that we are not going to be looking for other sources of revenue. So I wanted to make a point of that, i.e. the licensing or whatever things that might come up, that we will be looking at making sure that we are doing what we can to increase revenue also.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Councilmember Goldman.
So something I've been thinking about, I think this sort of jumps off from what Councilmember Riddle and Mayor French were saying, is trying to classify what here is mandatory versus what here is something the community has said they really want. And the reason I bring up that distinction is, let's say 911. The city is not going to pull out of 911. Yeah, that is a core service the public needs access to. In the event we put it up for a levy and the public votes it down, we would still need to provide 911 service. So I feel it's a cleaner sell for the levy to say, this is something we've heard over and over again that you really want. If this levy does not pass, we can't have it. So for instance, the 3 officers, that is something that we will still have a police force. We will not have those 3 officers, which means fewer traffic patrols. And so making it clear to the community, if the levy passes, this is what the city gets from it. If the levy doesn't pass, here's where we'll be with the status quo. I think it makes it a cleaner sell to the community about what are the consequences either way.
Yeah. I would just completely echo that. I think having it black and white and knowing what the trade-off is, not only is that easier for people to understand, but it's easier to communicate that out to a broad audience to really understand the trade-off. So I totally support that.
I think City Administrator Hill, you wanted to say something?
I didn't even raise my hand, but thank you. I was just thinking on the clarity of the 3 officers. I think the deputy mayor and I have had this conversation in the past, but just realizing that's not 3 new officers. This was just a look at covering the costs of the officers, you know, as many as we can that we have today. And that's all I wanted to cover.
Thank you for that. All right, so is any further questions? Oh, go ahead, Councilmember Leva.
So point of clarification, and this is for Attorney Pratt. So when we talk about this levy, and this is a public safety levy, I wanted to understand, is this not really a general fund levy, in which case there are other expenditures associated with our general fund? Meaning, can it only be limited to public safety? Because once we get this in as a general funds are not limited. So are we, I'm not understanding, is if we say this is for public safety, can the monies only be spent on public safety? Or can we say it's public safety and parks, or is it general fund?
If you choose I'll say an alternative where it is going to be used for a specific issue, public safety, then the money has to be spent on public safety. And the case law in the RCW says when you have an ordinance or a ballot measure, you can only have one thing in there. And so you've got to either pick public safety, and you could do another ballot measure for parks, but it has to be one or the other. You could do something just general fund. I think the city tried to do that once and it failed. And so the idea was to have it be specific so people understood what the money was going to be spent on. But if you say public safety, it's only public safety.
May I follow up?
Please.
So let's say you generate $1.5 million a year on a public safety levy increase. There's nothing to preclude you from using the other property tax levy monies you have for any other services.
Correct. Right.
So to put it simply, you could move monies around.
Your general fund is for you to do what you want.
It's fungible. You can use it on any.
Mhm.
Okay. If I may. The items here are the category, the annual costs. Would you, when you put out a levy, wouldn't those be sort of the whereas as the justification for the levy? Whereas our costs have increased in these kinds of categories, but doesn't say that we are going to spend $284,000 on public safety 911 dispatch. It just means that these are really whereas our costs have increased, we need to do this, and therefore we need this increase.
I would agree with that. You usually don't put in the whereas section how much you are exactly going to spend on, say, 911 dispatch, but you would include it as maybe one of the itemized things, public safety, such as 911 costs, jail costs, or new police officers, new vehicles. I'm not sure what all you might want to include.
So you might describe what you might spend the money on, but wouldn't necessarily put in the dollar amounts that you're going to spend it on.
Would not put on the dollar amounts. If you thought something was very important, you might want to put it in your explanatory statement, you know, kind of as an example. Our 911 costs have increased by X amount of dollars or 30%, or, you know, if you felt that was just facts, that might be helpful to people voting.
Okay.
Actually, I was gonna, unless it was related still.
I
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I was questioning kind of in that similar line. Is so then if we were to call out these specific areas, I just want to make sure that doesn't preclude us from using the money outside of just the called out area. So it's anything related to the safety piece, right?
Well, you're going to describe, I mean, public safety, it is a very broad term. So you're going to be kept very close to what you call out. We can't suddenly say we have to fix sidewalks and that's public safety. You wouldn't be able to, you're going to have to narrow it down.
Okay.
Oh, so Councilmember Riddle first.
The only thing that makes me kind of concerned about working with the officers' sort of positions is going back to that. If we don't get the levy, are we really gonna need to part with officers? I don't want us to approach the community with something that feels, you know, dire and then not have it be dire. Like, we need to be real honest and transparent, which is why I think calling out the things that are very, I mean, as Councilmember Lebo says, we do have an unallocated fund that we can cover us for the next biennium. But then that leaves us in a worse state, and a worse state, and a worse state. So we don't want to do that. That's just not a fiscally responsible stance to take, to continue and continue and continue to do that. I think the community just wants to know, based off of what I heard from last time we did a levy, is what are we actually getting for this? And the clear that we have that is truthful, honest, and transparent that we can provide to them is that this is what it's covering. Then I think we're going to have a greater positive response from the community that, okay, yeah, now I understand it, you know? So and I know sometimes just asking to cover salaries is sometimes just, it's hard to wrap your head around. What does that really mean? Does that mean we're really going to lose these officers? Does that mean they're just going to be paid less? Does that mean you're going to find money elsewhere? Like, so I want us to be able to be very clear and transparent and honest about what it means, what they're getting for it, whether it's very specific or just sort of things of this nature, depending on how we want to word the actual levy information, but that they understand what they're getting and what will happen if they don't pass it. That's the most important thing for me.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And of course, I think, the community wants to hear that. But at the same time, I don't want it to sound like extortion that you're going to lose these three for sure, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we're trying to avoid that tone deafness, right? So go ahead.
On point, if I may. Yeah, I appreciate my colleagues' thoughtfulness about this. And this is not a situation where we are not suggesting to the community that if we don't have increased revenues, whatever form that is, that we're going to be cutting officers. What will happen, I can assure you this, we'll have some very, very difficult decisions here in a short period of time. And what would probably happen is that we will have, for example, in the case of, in the coming months, we're going to have a total of probably 4 officers, vacant positions. We will probably not refill those positions, at least maybe 1 or 2 of them, depending on what the council's will is and what the community is looking for. There will be other additional difficult choices that will have to be made, regardless of what this council decides to do about a levy. I think the other thing that's really important, a distinction to make about the unallocated fund balances, largely those are made up of one-time revenues. They're not recurring. They're not coming back. They will never come
Absolutely.
back. And on the contrary, we're going to start seeing, we've already seen retreat from the federal government on any kind of support for projects that we have within this community. So going down that path is a very, very slippery slope. And I appreciate that you all recognize how serious that is, because those funds to allow us to do what we're doing operationally, and it's allowing us to move forward where we are. Spending those down to the reserve level is a dangerous place for us to be.
I think Councilmember Lebo, you still had a comment?
Thank you. So we've budgeted the 25-26 biennium. And so this levy lift would begin to accrue funds in the year 26. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that you're proposing that for each year, we would accrue $1.5 million, roughly. So
Plus the escalator.
Let's see.
plus the escalator. But in terms of if the citizens do not choose to approve the levy this fall, there will not be a reduction in services for 2026. Is that correct?
I'm going to defer to, either the mayor or the city administrator. I'm not really certain basically what the timing of all this is going to be. So,
But in context, we've already budgeted for 26. And absent some otherwise increases that we haven't become aware of, we do have the police positions budgeted. We do have 911 dispatch budgeted. These items are budgeted absent any significant increase that we are not currently aware of.
That's correct, Mr. Lebo, but I would also offer that I certainly am not one to wait until the well is dry. So when I say when it comes to, we're not talking about $1.5 million worth of cuts. That's absolutely accurate. However, remember that we're in a hole in this biennium when it comes to we're spending down funds that the preference would be not to do that. And I would offer that the longer we wait to make the difficult decisions, the more difficult it will be. This community has been at that edge of that cliff a couple of times, and as I've indicated before, and I know many of you probably get tired of me hearing this, it was a very, very, very difficult lift for many of your predecessors on the council to pull us out of that potential brink, away from that brink. So I would say that looking around at the other communities and seeing what is going on around the region, even though the economy has been thriving to a large degree up until this year, that is probably a good lens to look through about what the challenges that we could face in the future if we get ourselves down into a place where we continue to spend down into and not increase revenues.
So I guess to address your point, then it's really comes down to how much do you want to cut into that unallocated fund balance, and when is the right time to bolster that balance? And I think that's the decision before us. Councilmember Good, then Councilmember Goldman.
So basically, this levy is going to be a certain percentage of something. But the longer you wait, in order to catch up, the percentage will have to increase. So right now, the levy could be manageable, but the longer that you wait, the amount will go up. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct.
Okay.
Councilmember.
Yes, thanks. I will have an attempt at answering those 4 questions for me personally. So do we? For me, the answer is yes, because we need to, in my mind, we need to slow the rate at which we are eating into our unallocated funds. How long? I think 6 years seems like a reasonable duration. As to the other 2 questions, how much and for what, that I think requires us to really have a discussion. And for me, a big part of it is communication. What we've heard what the community wants. And so how much and for what items, it's going to be a lot of what can we justify to the community? What can we communicate clearly? I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from Prop 1 from 4 years ago that the community felt it was too big and too nebulous. And so I really want to make sure that we're learning from the Prop 1 of 4 years ago to make it, so this Prop 1 have the best chance of success.
And I appreciate you addressing the questions. Is anybody else? Go ahead, Councilmember Riddle.
I will do the same as my colleague. So do we? I believe the answer is yes. How long? I think the 6 years is also a very appropriate timeline. How much? I am in favor of doing a calculation, and I'm obviously more in favor of outside contracts that, like, let's cover those, and then that leaves us with the flexibility with the rest of the general fund to work what we need as our budget that we have more control over. If I were to do math on TV, which I'm totally not doing right now, I think that we can look at these sort of contract services that are required for us, plus, let's say, NEMCO, Crime Watch, the mental health program that we believe the community has already spoken very strongly that they want. We're going to be in that 1.4, 1.5 range, which is what you were targeting anyway. So I don't think I'm very far from what you've looked at as what the city kind of would need to bolster itself. So I'm in agreement with the how much. I kind of take a different take on for what, but still in that safety umbrella of coverage. I think our community would really appreciate us addressing this now, again, rather than waiting till the last minute. And, you know, if our situation's getting more challenging budget wise, I know our community is too. It's going to be harder to ask then, and we're going to have a bigger gap to cover. So I think it's prudent to go out now with something that's manageable, as Councilmember Good said, rather than waiting till it becomes something that's really difficult for our community to handle.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
I agree with that.
Okay.
It's better to be manageable.
I would very much agree with that too. I think in light of too what everyone's experiencing and with just life in general, it's not unreasonable for your city to also have costs that increase. And that's something that I don't think is going to shock our residents. I think where we can really lend a lot of opportunity is around calling out what you had shared, Councilmember Goldman, about highlighting exactly what it is and being very transparent in that. So I guess to kind of take it back to where you had asked the question is, do we? I like how you put it, Councilmember Good, is let's just slow it down now and make it manageable, make it bite-sized. So I would vote yes. And then for how long, I look to you guys for that duration, for that 6 years. And then for what is that area, I think would be really good to split the hairs in there and really understand exactly what for, and then find the communication to then get that out to residents.
All right, thank you very much, Councilmember. So I think then, I don't want to cut off debate here. Does anybody have anything else they want to add? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
Just a little historical context. I love your questions, Tracy. This is really instructive. I think about previous Prop ones. And one of the things I think is really important to note, the previous opposition to the last Prop 1 in 2021, there wasn't a whole lot of run up. There wasn't a lot of time to get that thing, in place. I think, and the world was in a different place then too. But the opposition said, we're opposing this because there's no term. It's continuous. So we would support something that is limited and reasonable and moderate and whatever. So now fast forward to where we are now. I hear rumblings out there that some of those same individuals, not all of them, to the credit of a couple of them, are the same individuals are saying no. They're saying now when we're talking about a limited term, renewable kind of situation, are just opposed to it in the aggregate, or are they opposed to, I'm not sure. But if you go down through those different things, how much? Prop 1, 2011, too much. How long? Unlimited. For what? Who knows? They had no clue. Prop 1, 4 years ago, how much? I think it was larger than some of us wanted, honestly. How long? Unlimited. That was not a great call. For what? It was more defined, but it wasn't to the level of standards that I believe this body is expecting. So in terms of that context, I listened to what you're saying. Those questions you've answered, and I think you have a very good framework for saying to the community, do you believe this is the right path to go down?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to hear from you on Thursday, we'll continue this discussion on Thursday, is those of you who suggested there might be some modifications to what we ask for, please basically come prepared with, not necessarily the amounts, because we'll have to research that, but certainly the actual line items. And that's where I think this discussion can go. I'm getting sort of a head nod here that we should proceed. So let's try to basically hone this to be the best possible thing we can make. Go ahead.
So the title of this is Public Safety and Parks. So we're going to be removing the parks.
That's my fault. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Okay.
Just want to clarify. Thank you.
All right. Anything else? And we'll hand the gavel back to you then, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, colleagues. Appreciate that. Since this is a special meeting, we can't add any additional items to the menu, as it were. Just a reminder of future schedule. Work session, 6 p.m. on Thursday. There's also a regular council meeting at 7 p.m. and we have a public hearing scheduled at that time as well about middle housing. Reminder that there also is a special meeting scheduled for Monday, June 16th. This is not on your agenda. And then reminder, City Hall is closed for Juneteenth. Thank you, colleagues who helped put that into effect a number of years ago. That's an important holiday. Monday, June 23rd, Committee of the Whole meeting. And then finally, June 26th, there's a budget finance meeting, as well as following that, that'll be a short budget and finance meeting. And then following that, there is a city council regular meeting, and the expectation is that the administration will be looking for you to be passing the middle housing and subdivision code, ADU, et cetera, that evening in advance of the model ordinance bearing down on us like a freight train. So have I missed anything, staff or colleagues, in terms of schedule? Okay, I'm getting no alarm bells sounded from anyone. So if there's nothing else, which there can't be, we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mark.